This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is David Stockman. He is a former congressman. He was in the Reagan administration. He knows something about politics, economics, government. Actually, he knows more than something. He knows a hell of a lot. His book, Trump's War on Capitalism. Now, don't let that title throw you. Yes, David is not supporting Trump in the next election. He's supporting RFK Jr. However, you're going to find that the way David thinks, the perspectives he has, you're going to find yourself generally aligned. I know I did. Again, people make different choices. They have different decisions, different perspectives on who they think would be the best next president of America. And David has his choice. But his perspectives on what goes on behind the scenes, the system, the deep state, all that kind of stuff, we're on the same page. Without any further delay from me, I hope you enjoy this conversation with David Stockman. Here's where I want to jump in today. Let me just start with the basics. It really seems like to me it'd be a fair appraisal, a fair way to say it, that you really despise Donald Trump. Fair?
Partly fair. I do admire one thing and one thing alone. He's got all the right enemies. By that, I mean the mainstream media, CNN, the Washington Post, New York Times, the Washington establishment, even the leadership of both parties, the uniparty. The fact that they were all against him should have given him some real credit, at least as I viewed it. But the problem was, even though he had all the right enemies, proposed that he was going to be attacking hammer and tong, the swamp, he ended up with policies that were totally wrong across the board. His fiscal policy was a disaster. He was the worst spender and borrower of any president, Democrat or Republican, since World War II. His views on monetary policy and the Fed are downright primitive, populist nonsense crankery. Again, the number one problem in the United States today is a rogue central bank that's out of control. Here you had Trump spending 4 years harassing the Fed to make policy even easier as it was desperately trying to get interest rates off the zero bound where they had been ever since the 2008-2009 crisis. When it comes to free markets and free enterprise, he's utterly without principles. No one who had any understanding both of the Constitution as well as free markets would have ever done the across-the-board sweeping lockdowns out of the blue. Was totally unwarranted by the facts of the virus. Then they wouldn't have compounded that sin with $6 trillion worth of bailouts and stimmies and COVID relief. Yeah, $4 trillion of that he signed. The last $2 trillion tranche more or less was teed up in the election because he advocated another $2,000 per family giveaway check. When you look at that whole range of policies, which is the reason you have a Republican Party, which supposedly is in a competitive contest with the Democrats, who are the party of government, he ended up being a proponent of big government when it comes to the key issues, fiscal, monetary, foreign trade, what I call his border wars and his trade wars. He ended up with a worse record than any president, as I said, since World War II. Now, some conservatives are likely to say, yes, but we did have a great economy. You have to give him that much credit. We didn't have a great economy. We had the second half of a recovery that had been underway since 2009, mainly the regenerative forces of private capitalism. He didn't have much to do with it. But even then, the growth rate average, as I've documented in the book, during his 4 years was the worst of any of the 11 presidents since Truman. It was 1.5%. The average was 3.0%. Kennedy Johnson was 5% per year. Reagan was 3.8% per year, and so on. The growth rate during the 4 years of Trump was the lowest end to end of any president in the post-war period.
Let me interject. So let me widen this out a little bit. If we look at all that, I don't think most thinking people are not going to really say, oh, David, you're wrong. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. The question I have in my mind, you know this, a significant number of the GOP or MAGA or whatever you want to call them, the right, conservatives right now, clearly support Trump. I think back to when Trump ran and he was on stage with all the folks and he made the Rosie O'Donnell comment and essentially won the GOP nomination that night. It seems like it's almost like a replay of those types of candidates running against Trump again. They all seem like empty suits. The question I have, if you're right about everything you're saying, and I think it's fair appraisal, why did the system, the deep state, whatever the hell you want to call it, the uniparty, why did it go out of its way to make sure that, especially the first 2 years of this guy's term, why did they go out of their way with the Russian collusion thing? If the guy was really just not so great, you make the case, if he really was going down the wrong path, why was there this need? And I think this is where his support comes from today. Why was there this need to take it to a level that was just seemingly off the charts? I mean, from my perspective, a little bit younger at the time, we can look back to Watergate, but it seems like the effort of the uniparty to take Trump down, the whole FBI thing, the Russian thing, all the P-tape, all this stuff, that seems so over the top. And you're a guy with a lot of government experience. Why did they go that far?
I think that's a great question, but I want to separate out the MAGA support out at the grassroots, which has nothing to do with the deep state attack that was launched during the 2016 campaign and then became almost around-the-clock effort once he was inaugurated. I think the deep state was so shocked that an outside the system bully, loudmouth, cowboy, uncontrollable politician beat Hillary Clinton, who was the very embodiment of at least the modern establishment, both of Washington and the Democratic Party, especially the darling of the mainstream media and all the rest of it. They were so shocked by the result the morning after in November 2016 that they went into this, what we call Trump derangement syndrome that fed upon itself. It was already underway. We know from all of the revelations about Russiagate and so forth that was underway in the spring, summer, and fall of 2016. It just went into hyperdrive, high gear after the election and ended up with all these investigations, 2 impeachments, and so forth. That was the reason. It was just shock that someone who was unschooled and potentially uncontrollable, they were wrong about that. Trump was easily controlled.
You're a guy who's been around for a long time. What would the exact fear have been for them to pull off what they pulled off, which really seemed to be over the top? So what would have been some of the specific fears? Or was that just all nonsense in the sense that it was like, hey, we've got the uniparty power. We surround Washington, D.C. with all these counties, Loudoun, Fairfax, Arlington. We control these places. Let's just take him down. I don't know if they really had a fear or it was just like, we've got the power. Let's do it.
Well, I mean, they had the power, but I think it was a little more complicated. First of all, there was a visceral reaction kind of across the board. Trump's a pretty obnoxious personality. I mean, an egomaniac like you've never seen, a bully, a loudmouth. He emits bile, bombast, and baloney on a round-the-clock basis, practically. There was that reaction, but I think he said things during the campaign that went to the heart of establishment policy. He said, NATO is obsolete. Why do we have these forever wars? He was raising, actually, in the campaign, some important questions, in my view, that really stirred up the deep state. They didn't want the gravy train to stop. They wanted the forever wars to keep going. They wanted the great hegemon on the Potomac to continue to sit astride the planet with the 700 bases and all the rest of it that we have. I think that's what triggered it from what you would call the national security apparatus, the military industrial complex, the contractors. Then the Democratic politicians jumped on board because they were in mourning after shock. They really couldn't believe that this character had beat their prized candidate. Hillary was supposed to break the glass ceiling, whatever you want to call it, and become the first female president. And everything fell apart in the middle of the night on election day. They were in shock. One thing fueled the next, and we ended up where we did.
I think it's amazing. It speaks to the American system. Maybe it'll never happen again, but that a guy who was a game show host, a guy that was a developer, a bombastic guy, as you said, a lot of pretty models for wives and stuff like this, that a guy like that could throw his hat into the ring with zero support except the people he could reach via social media. And to pull it off is quite amazing. Now, you, as a guy who really knows something about the inner workings in that city, I think the problem he had is once he got elected, people have to imagine, I think this is true, I'd seen it said that he had maybe been in D.C. 11 times his whole life.
There you go.
I don't think he knew anything about it. Now, in a way, there's a lot of people in America that respect this. The thing is if you show up in D.C. with no team and a team that comes with you doesn't know what the hell's going on, then you set yourself up for the takedown. You set yourself up for the legal malaise, everything that comes at you that maybe more experienced players would have the team to deal with. But on the flip side, that's one of the reasons the American public loves the guy, is because they feel like, look, I'm a guy that grew up in the DC area. To see houses in Vienna, Virginia, where I grew up, for $3 million today is absolutely insane. And the only reason, 6 of the top 10 wealthiest counties that surround DC is because of just this whole system we're talking about. I think you make a great point that his policies, he didn't really do anything. I think that's the best way to say it. On the flip side, I don't know really what the guy was going to do once he showed up and the FBI went balls to the wall on him.
The metaphor that I use constantly to set the stage for this, Trump really was like the dog who always chased the car down the street, and one day he finally caught it and had no idea what to do. Trump himself, and I've had people very close to Trump tell me the next morning he was in as much shock as the rest of the country that he won. And these are people that are very close to him. It's not apocryphal or some kind of social media myth. It was true. The point is, he had no program. He had no schooling as to the history of all these issues, from NATO to border policy to complexities of a $22 trillion trading system in the imports and exports globally. And he didn't have any idea of personnel because he didn't have colleagues and associates who had spent a lot of time in Washington. Well, you could say that was a good thing. It might be for an ordinary guy who was a very competent outsider, a CEO, a university president, I don't care, who somehow got elected and came in on a program of house cleaning and did that and brought in new blood that knew what they were doing. But Trump had no idea. For instance, take the point that he did campaign on a slogan called America First, and there was a lot to that. Why are we in Ukraine? Why are we still in NATO? Why do we have 29,000 troops in South Korea, 50,000 in Japan? I mean, this all ended 75 years ago. He raised all the right questions, but then he ends up appointing Pompeo, who's the biggest neocon warmonger that's ever come down the pike, as CIA director, and then Secretary of State, John Bolton, as his national security advisor, who is sort of like neocon central. Bolton, I mean, he's terrible.
Do you think Trump was so inexperienced that he literally didn't really even have any choices? It was that complicated to show up with the keys to the White House and you've got to make these appointments, and you don't have a team, you don't have a network in DC. I can't imagine being in that position, because then you have to select names. You really don't know everything about them. You really don't know what the hell they're going to do, and you've got to command this ship. I'm not giving the guy an excuse, but in a way, it is pretty daunting to show up in that position. And you know something about DC.
Yes, but here's the thing. The problem with Trump, he's such a unrelenting egomaniac. He's such a arrogant personality that he had no clue whatsoever about what he didn't know. I mean, he flies by the seat of his ample britches, as I think I called it at one point in the book, changes his mind about everything from day to day. I'm totally opposed to Nikki Haley's candidacy, but she's right when she says he's the candidate of chaos, and it follows him everywhere. Bill Barr was right when he said right near the end there in 2016 or 2020 that if you believe in his policies, don't expect him to implement them because he can't organize a one-car funeral. These are the characteristics that turned a situation where you could have had a fresh candidate, a fresh politician positioned to clean house in a big way. But if you're arguing that maybe NATO is obsolete, which it totally is, and that the forever wars should stop, I mean, even someone with a little bit of common sense would say, I don't think Pompeo's my man. Why am I talking to John Bolton? I mean, everything in his mind is fleeting. It's compartmentalized. It's an impulse of the moment. I don't think he's dangerous in this whole Biden Democrat struggle for the life of democracy in America. It has nothing to do with that. He's not a dangerous wannabe dictator because he's totally disorganized, doesn't really have an agenda that would take you at any significant length in that direction.
In 2023, though, you fully appreciate that the numbers of people on the so-called right that want to vote for him are significant. I'm not necessarily sure that people are supporting Trump at this stage of the game in 2023, after everything we've seen in the last 7 or so odd years. I'm not sure people are supporting Trump based on his policy anymore. I think they're supporting him as a fly in the ointment. I think we've reached the point in American politics, like if you're on the right, someone's on the right, and they say, what are my choices? There's a standard issue list of these kind of neocon types, Nikki Haley leading the bunch. People start to have memories of like, oh my God, it's like John McCain in a skirt. It's like George W. Bush. It's like George Sr. Bush or whatever.
In high heels.
Right. People have these memories and they just say, well, God, I don't know if this guy Trump is going to be successful. They say, well, he's a fly in the ointment. I think that's really all it is at this stage of the game. I don't know if people really expect anything other than he is the agent of chaos. And if we choose chaos, at least we won't get more of typical GOP or more deep state. That seems to be the entire thinking of the electorate.
You're right. When you use the word entire thinking, I would put quotations around that because I don't think there's much thinking. There is an impulse that's deep and important, and the impulse is that he must be our guy, he must be our champion, because everybody who's against him are exactly the people who have been making life so difficult for the Main Street American for decades after decades. To go back to my slogan, he has the right enemies. That's why the public supports him. Every night that CNN does another takedown, they probably generate a few more votes. My point is, so what? Having the right enemies doesn't get you very far, especially since you've had a 4-year trial run and you accomplished nothing except to totally tarnish the Republican brand. The public can't know what Republicans stand for.
In defense, could the argument be made that the Republican brand, starting with the two Bushes, McCain, etc., had tarnished itself already in the preceding 20, 25 years?
Well, yeah, I think there was some tarnishment, if that's a word. He, on the issues that are important, the reason for the Republicans to be in existence is not to be an instrument of the neocon intellectuals who are ensconced in the Beltway and all that prosperity that you described a while ago. Their job is not to become nativist fanatics about the border. Obviously, it's not to be big tariff protectionists. That isn't the job of the Republican Party. The core of the Republican Party is financial discipline, fiscal responsibility, sound money. Let the free market produce the prosperity that generates the tide that lifts all boats. That's the job of the Republican Party. He totally undermined those core principles and led it off into the culture wars and into the border wars and into the trade wars, into the COVID fiasco. He already proved that he doesn't deserve another chance. So you say, well, does that mean that you're for Biden? Of course I'm not. I am actually for RFK. I mean, I'm for Kennedy. I think that he may have a chance to dislocate the Electoral College so badly that the vote goes to the House of Representatives, where he might have enough leverage to force some big changes, particularly in national security policy and this massive out-of-control defense budget we have.
As you bring him up, it's an interesting point that you bring him up, writing the foreword to your book. So as a Gen X guy, I find this conversation with a lot of Gen X friends these days, and I mentioned to where I am right now, I find myself here in my 50s going back and trying to piece together a history. After watching something like Trump unfold, the Russian collusion thing unfold, it's then forcing a lot of people in my generation, and I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. speaks to some of these issues, but it's forcing a lot of people in my generation to look back in time and say, well, if this thing with Russia wasn't correct, what should I believe about Nixon? And then the question starts to become, well, okay, what should I believe about JFK? And then you start to say, well, hold on. How did LBJ go unnoticed, so to speak, in many ways? And so I think what I'm finding myself is looking back at the course of my adult life, being born in 1968, and saying, what has been going on, essentially? It's leaving a lot of people questioning everything and starting to think, well, gosh, if there could be a phony Russian collusion about Trump, how am I supposed to wrap my arms around history as presented in the last 4 or 5 decades, especially since World War II? It seems quite difficult to do. Now, you've got a few more years on me and a touch more experience. Can you appreciate that a lot of people are really starting to wonder, what is America these days?
I like the way you put this, because you were born into the world in 1968. I was born politically in 1968. I was a senior in college. I was an SDS member, an anti-war protester. We thought LBJ's war in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, was genocide, which it was, the worst thing that America had ever done. And we were on the barricades demanding change. And then as the spring unfolded, I was ringing doorbells for RFK Sr. That's where I entered political life in 1968, understanding that the Cold War wasn't all it's cracked up to be, that American foreign policy was way off base. Frankly, I had another encounter with that machine in the early 80s when I was trying to cut the budget, and every dollar I cut, they added 3 more to the Defense Department, and we got nowhere except big deficits heading down the road where we are today with the $34 trillion public debt. You know, it was $1 trillion a few days after I became OMB director and Reagan took the oath of office. It was $1 trillion, and it had taken practically 2 centuries to get there. Now it's $34 trillion. I have some perspective on this too. The perspective is that foreign policy has been totally off base ever since Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex in 1960, and that it might become a self-perpetuating fiscal power that makes the case for its own budget. That's exactly what we have today. Trump needs to be criticized for that as well, and I do in the book. The defense budget was $600 billion when he took over, and it was way too big given the fact that Cold War was long over. Russia had an economy of $1.5 trillion. Ours was $20 trillion. There was no reason for any increase at all, and if he had been a true Republican in the Robert Taft tradition, he would have cut the defense budget substantially. He actually increased it wantonly to $850 billion because he thought he has this egomaniacal view that foreign policy is all about who's the genius at the negotiating table. And if I have all kinds of firepower behind me, I can intimidate the rest of them into doing what I think needs to be done. That isn't a valid approach to foreign policy. That's the only reason that you have this disconnect between questioning NATO, questioning the forever wars, adding 45% to the defense budget, to $250 billion he added to the defense budget for no valid reason whatsoever. It only just buried us that much deeper in a fiscal quagmire because it allowed the neocon warhawk Republicans in the House and Senate all the money they ever dreamed about. And now they're dug in on, as you see going on by the day, defense budgets that are nearly $900 billion, and there's no way they can make ends meet if they're not going to cut entitlements or domestic discretionary spending, and you can't cut interest, and the cost is now at $1 trillion and rising very rapidly. I mean, the whole thing is a gigantic mess.
I want to shift you, though, a little bit here, because you are a guy who's got a lot of experience going back a long time, even though your book is all about saying, hey, I'm not a Trump guy, and here's why. You do give lessons across the spectrum of politics, economics, etc. One of the things you do point out is that, like, hey, even though I'm a critic of Trump, there's only so much the American president can do or does. With that little mini setup, I'd love for you to take us all back to perhaps the 80s, and I'll bring it up into the 90s and the dot-com era and stuff like that. Where I want you to go is to give your perspective on interest rate movements. I know in the 80s, look, okay, Volcker said, hey, we got to bring down inflation. He jacked rates. My father always tells me about his first mortgages being over, 14, 15%, whatever. Okay, we get through the 80s. Then we get to this unique situation, 94, 95, especially with Netscape going public in summer of 95. So the dot-com races are off. A lot of people will still look back fondly and say, oh my gosh, it was a great economy under Bill Clinton. Well, okay, there's all kinds of capital gains spinning off during this bubble. The only reason Al Gore was not elected was because the dot-com bubble burst. Then after the dot-com bubble burst, this is just my laying it out, and I'm going to let you comment, the Fed starts saying, okay, let's bring those rates down. And then lo and behold, everyone's seen the Big Short movie. So we know what happens next. We get another bubble, and then we know what happens after the 08 thing. They jack rates down again. Then that goes on for a lot longer than people probably expected. As you mentioned earlier, when Trump first came in, they were trying to get rates back up. But here we are finally to some higher rates now. But this creates all kinds of situations in the underlying economy, especially something like the markets, because at this stage of the game, from my perspective, if I'm looking at rates where they are now, dramatically higher than 18 months ago, equity markets at all-time highs, this doesn't seem like a time to be celebrating, at least in my adult lifetime. When you get rates jacking up, Fed jacking rates, and you got assets at all-time highs, this usually doesn't end well, regardless of who's the president. Fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. I think the inflection point that you identified and then moved on from was 1987, the summer of 87. Volcker's term was up. Volcker was the greatest central banker we ever had. I'm skeptical of central banking, but if you're going to have one, Volcker is the kind of solid, sound money guy you want at the helm. The Republican politicians around Reagan, who was starting to lose it a little bit by then, detested Volcker because he had been unwilling to bend when they demanded easier money in the interim off elections in 1986, and they were worried about 1988. Politicians led by Jim Baker said, Volcker's done. Let's replace him. How about Alan Greenspan, who at one time was a very solid, sound money, gold standard conservative economist who stumbled into Washington in the 70s, decided he liked the renown of it, was appointed Fed chairman, and had a crisis within weeks of being sworn in, because I was very close to him at the time and I knew what was going on. He panicked in the fall of 1987, pulled out the stops, bailed out Wall Street that dropped by 24% in one day in so-called Black Monday. It was off to the races after that. The 1990s appear to be a time of great prosperity. It's because you had a new sheriff at the Fed. They were printing money aggressively. That created the first stock market bubble, a lot of capital gains revenue. The budget, therefore, looked a lot better than it was. I have to say, at least there was a semblance of fiscal accountability in Washington then. In addition to all the windfall revenue gain, they did pass budget control measures, both under Bush near the end, which is when he moved his lips and signed a bill that included tax revenues, and then again under Clinton. Put those two things together, and you had relative fiscal stability by the end of the decade, but you had the Fed in the business of monetizing the debt pretty aggressively. And then when you got the younger Bush in and they decided the Republicans were owed a tax cut and they decided to have the war on terror, ramp up the defense budget dramatically in Afghanistan and then in the Iraq war.
Do you think that the war on terror is one of the biggest lies of our lifetime?
Yes, absolutely. It was a utterly flukish event that happened on 9/11. That's not to take away the disaster that it was or the lives that were lost, but it was utterly flukish. The idea that we needed to suddenly crank up a military response from one end of the Middle East to the other and then demonize the entire Muslim population, I think, was a catastrophic error, but it was obviously in the interest of the military-industrial complex because now they had a reason to jack up the defense budget dramatically and for all kinds of new or replacement weapon systems that otherwise I don't think would have been funded. Yeah, it was a terrible mistake.
As a younger man, I have to say, I used to enjoy listening to two people in particular talk. I used to enjoy, when I was a younger man, listening to Dick Cheney talk and listening to John McCain talk. I must say, as an older man now, I detest the memories of those two men.
Yeah. I was an older man then and much older now. And I detest with unreserved antipathy, really, both McCain and Cheney. And remember, Cheney and I were colleagues in the House in the late 70s. I was elected in 76. He was elected in 78. He had been sort of a young hotshot in the Ford administration and ended up staff director near the end. He was a pretty conventional conservative at the time, and we worked together on a lot of things that had to do with fiscal control, energy deregulation, and the fundamental platform that I've been talking about. Somehow he went astray in the 1980s on the whole foreign policy thing, became defense secretary, as you remember, and drank the Kool-Aid apparently at the Pentagon, ended up where he did with Bush the Younger.
I like Bush the Younger. I like that one. What I'm going to do here at the end is I'm going to wrap it up at the end and take you back and let you map out what you see unfolding this year and the scenarios, why you said supporting RFK Jr. I'm also curious to take you to March of 2009, because it seems like March of 2009 was an interesting pivot point in the sense that if the actions, and I know there was an assortment of actions taken in March of 2009, March of 2009 was the lows of the U.S. equity markets. It didn't feel like at that moment they weren't going back up. They were going straight down. I look at situations like this and I say, well, what's the end goal of the policymakers, the Fed, et cetera? It just felt like, okay, we can do some hanky-panky behind the scenes. We can kick the can down the road. We don't know what will happen 10 or 15 years from now, but let's just kick the can because we might be able to mitigate or get the wealth effect started up again with zero interest rates. Speak to your perspective on March of 2009, because it feels like we haven't fully experienced what March of 2009 was.
Yeah, March of 2009 was another great inflection point. October 1987, when Greenspan got in the saddle at the Fed, was one. March of 2009 was the day that Bernanke's folly became institutionalized as policy.
Do you think that if Trump was to win the second term, to get in there for a second term, do you think that he would listen to voices like yourself? Do you think anything has changed about him? You make a strong case and your opinions are very clear about how you see it. Do you think the guy wants to be remembered that way if he got in for a second term? Is there the potential to surprise David Stockman? Is there potential there to surprise you, or you're just saying no way?
Well, I'm constantly surprised as the world twists and turns the way it does. Okay, that's fair enough. But I just don't see it in Trump's character and DNA at all. He's going to come in boiling over with resentment about the way he was treated during the first term, the way his candidacy has been treated this time, all of the villainization that occurred in the interim. He's going to be about vengeance. That's the first thing. And the second thing, he's going to be about trying to prove he was right about the border thing, build the wall even bigger, get more money for even more hobnail boots, enforcing the border and all this stuff, which I think is totally wrong. He's likely to dive even deeper into totally counterproductive foreign trade protectionism. And I don't think he's going to have much interest at all in the core issues of the fiscal disaster.
Given your perspective going back a long time, and you use the word vengeance, if I had to observe the Biden administration for the last handful of years, it sure seems like vengeance is a word that could be applied. Have we reached this weird place in American politics where good people collaborating to perhaps get some achievement is just gone? It is literally about the fight for the power. Then when you get the power, it's destroy the other people. Because I don't think Trump's unique with this vengeance thing at all. It seems like I just saw something the other day. I don't know who it was, maybe one of the prosecutors, saying that just the people that were in the vicinity of the Capitol on January 6th, thousands and thousands of people that never went inside were going to be prosecuted. This seems odd. And it seems like it's just designed to get each side riled up more and more and more. I lay this scenario out. Can you imagine a scenario in the future where America doesn't function effectively at all?
I can imagine it because I think we're almost there now. And I agree with you. The machinery of governance and particularly of justice has been weaponized by both parties. When they went after Trump for 4 years on all of these phony Russian hoax charges, that's exactly what they were doing. Why would they expect any difference when the Republicans get in or if Trump is reelected? This idea that you've got courts all over the country going after Trump for totally unreasonable things. I mean, all those documents he had were most of them, I've looked at all of the documents case, the national security documents.
Taking him off the ballot seems...
Yeah, well, taking him off the ballot is even worse because it's starting a precedent, resurrecting a 1867 or 66 Civil War statute. I mean, the amendment, the 14th Amendment, this is indicative that the politics of vengeance are animating the system. It's a very worrisome moment. I don't know what could break the spell of this other than an election that creates a crisis that goes to the House of Representatives, and the one adult, there's only one adult in this whole campaign right now, and it's RFK Jr.
I was going to bring him up because I wanted you to lay out this scenario. In fact, it was about, was it 6 months ago or so, where he was really getting a lot of traction. Gen X and millennial men were really gravitating towards him because he was laying out a scenario about essentially COVID and the vaccinations and all this stuff. And a lot of people were saying, well, this guy sounds really rational. A lot of people were gravitating towards him. What kind of scenario could you imagine? I mean, because it doesn't look like, I mean, if I have to look at what happened with Bernie in the last couple of elections, I would think RFK Jr. is going to get nowhere close to running. I mean, they're not going to put him on a stage with Biden. He would eviscerate Biden in a debate. Explain how you could see something unfolding.
Well, I think he can get on the ballot in most of the states. He's got a pretty huge grassroots organization emerging right now. If he gets on the ballot, remember the country is so closely divided between red state, blue county, blue county. that it's very unlikely that either Biden or Trump, and those likely are the candidates, will get a clear plurality in the Electoral College. So in that environment where it's close anyway on a two-man race, in a three-man race with the Kennedy name and with discontent in both wings of the uniparty, the progressives are losing it with the Washington Democrats, and the true economic conservatives are not very happy with the Republicans. That's why you had the revolt against McCarthy and so forth. It's possible that he could win a number of small states if he focuses the campaign on New Hampshire or Utah or one or two other states that could be picked off. And the Electoral College ends up without 270 votes to either Trump or Biden. It goes to the U.S. House. The House of Representatives votes by state delegation, not by numbers. So Wyoming has the same vote as California and New York and Massachusetts and New Jersey and all the other liberal states. It might be possible in that environment for RFK to be either the kingmaker or the king, one of the two, through negotiating a high-profile, high-stakes national resolution of some of the big issues that we're dealing with.
Would his uncle or his father have been considered Democrats today in 2023? 2024, I mean.
Yeah, as I said, I was ringing doorbells for RFK because he was the candidate against the war. He was the candidate against the military-industrial complex. Robert Kennedy Sr. would have been shown the door in today's Washington Democrat Party long, long ago. JFK famously in June 1963 gave that great American University speech where he essentially restaged the whole view of where the world was at that time with the Cold War and laid out a path towards what could have been a negotiated end of the Cold War much, much earlier than happened by happenstance in the late 80s. Neither of them would probably be welcome at all in today's party. And by the way, Kennedy Sr., who was a pretty big political actor in his own right, I mean, he was head of the SEC when Roosevelt first got it through in 1934, I think it was. He was an advocate of Fortress America. He didn't want U.S. policy of global hegemony and forces from one end of the planet to the other and interventions and occupations and all that went with it. He would have been utterly unwelcome in the Democrat Party today that at the drop of a hat rushes to defend the CIA, the national security establishment, the defense budget, the insanity in Ukraine and everything else we're doing.
I don't think that you will sway Trump voters, David, but I don't think people listening will dislike you. I think they'll say, well, God, that guy sees how all the pieces fit together. I think they can learn something. The book, Trump's War on Capitalism. Great stuff, David. I appreciate, again, the education. It's just the experience. It's nice of you to share with everybody because you know the things that you've seen, the things that you know. Most people don't have a chance to spend their life to acquire this knowledge and insight. So I appreciate you for sharing. And even though, again, like some people might say, well, gosh, I don't like his view on who he wants to support. But I think they would all appreciate the things that you've just said in this hour-long conversation, because I'm sure most of my listeners would probably agree. I appreciate that.
Glad to be with you. Sooner or later, we got to get to the facts. We have to understand the history that has come before. We're not doing that very well as a country right now, but it's never too late to start.
David, where can we send people? The book, Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff. Where's your best website, David?
I publish a newsletter every day called David Stockman's Contra Corner. It's on Substack. You can subscribe directly. So what I'm talking about in this book, what we've discussed for the last hour, covers the topics that I address daily based on what's happening in the world, the latest developments. That's called David Stockman's Contra Corner. You can find it at my website by that name.
David, I appreciate it. Please keep me posted on future books. I'd love to have you on again in the future and not wait so long this next time. I always enjoy the insights.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up
down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.